Hello, everyone, and welcome to our event today, the protection of the judiciary and the wider ecosystem. And thank you very much for joining us wherever you are. My name is Alex Just. I'm a senior consultant and employed barrister at Montfort Communications. Hello, everyone. And I'm going to be sharing today's event. As you can hear, that was actually the event coming through on YouTube as well. So we're very excited to have people joining in from around the world. As I said, I'm going to be chairing today's event on behalf of our two hosts, the Better Justice Association and the UCL Judicial Institute. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to tell you a little bit about the white paper which has inspired today's event. The Better Justice Association, as many of you know, is led by Mehmet Gün. It's an NGO based in Turkey whose work focuses on improving the country's judiciary by developing what they hope are universally acceptable solutions to various problems and issues regarding the judiciary and the rule of law more broadly. And over the last year, the team at the BJA have worked very hard to produce a whole series of concrete proposals for reform, which could be implemented in Turkey, but which the organization also hopes is relevant to countries and jurisdictions outside of Turkey. And today we're going to be looking in particular, and we're going to hear from Mehmet shortly about some of the ideas around protecting judicial independence. Today, I think we really do have a fantastic panel. We've got a genuine group of people who are very well versed, both in the academic side of this whole discussion, but also in terms of advising judiciaries and on the sort of practical ways in which people have attempted to successfully and in some cases less so put in place measures that can ensure judicial independence. First of all, we hear from Professor Cheryl Thomas, who's an honorary QC. She's at University College London and is the co-director of the UCL Judicial Institute. We also have Professor Zoltan Fleck, who's a professor of law and sociology at ELTE, the university in Budapest. And we will also hear, after we've heard from Mehmet Gün, from Professor Nuno Garupa, who's a professor of law at George Mason University's Anton Scalia Law School. Now, they're all going to be giving us a variety of international perspectives on what I think you'll agree is a very topical issue. We have the opportunity at the end to have a discussion, and also if you do have any questions, please send them through on the, for those of you who are watching on the Zoom webinar platform in the Q&A section, and those will be sent through to me, and hopefully we'll be able to put those through to some of the panelists. So to start our discussion today, Professor Cheryl Thomas is going to set up some of the sort of general background to judicial independence. She will also speak a little bit about the UK experience, and for those of you watching from the UK, you'll know that we have had to deal with some pressures, to put it that way, that have been put on the judiciary, both from the media and from certain political sort of areas of both civil society and from politicians in recent years. And she'll also give us some insights on some of the work that she's done through the UCL Judicial Institute and in her role helping to organise the Judicial Attitude Survey. So I'm delighted now to hand over to Cheryl.
Thanks very much, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be invited to speak with such a distinguished panel today. I'm going to address really three main points in my allotted 10 minutes, I think. The first is really some misconceptions, but also some common approaches to judicial independence across a wide range of judiciaries. The second, as Alex said, is I'll talk a little bit about the recent experience in the UK, where judicial decisions have been criticised by government and the judiciary has come under attack by the media. I'm also going to then really just share with you some of the findings of the UK Judicial Attitude Survey, which has helped us understand a bit about the impact on the judiciary of these types of challenges to judicial authority. So first of all, just to address what I think is a general misconception about judicial independence, it's often suggested that judicial independence requires that the judiciary control all aspects of its recruitment, promotion, discipline, or financing of the judiciary. And that certainly is not the case. I mean, there is no ideal arrangement between the judiciary and other political branches that guarantees judicial independence in every jurisdiction. But it is a misconception to see judicial independence as requiring complete judicial control over all aspects of the judiciary. And I think it's also really important to point out that each country needs to consider how their own individual political, legal, and judicial systems will actually affect judicial independence. And that's really important when undertaking sort of major reforms to the judiciary. And I'll give you just one example. So I think it's a critical factor in judicial independence can be whether there is a career judiciary where judges are recruited at a very early age, usually immediately out of law school, and they stay in the judiciary throughout their working lives. And this is the case in most civil law jurisdictions, particularly in Europe. Or whether you have a judicial system where judges are appointed only after a very substantial time in legal practice. And this is the case, as many of you will know, in most common law jurisdictions. So this type of approach can really create a different legal and judicial culture, which can affect judicial independence. So, for instance, when judges are appointed later in life after an independent legal career, there's much more likely to be an ingrained sense of independence amongst judges and also strong support from the legal profession for the independence of the judiciary. But in contrast, judges in career judiciaries are much more likely to see themselves as sort of part of the government machinery and much more likely to identify with civil servants than with independent legal professions. So the mechanisms for dealing with challenges to judicial independence really need to bear these sort of wider structural and cultural factors in mind. So given all that, I thought I would just highlight a couple of common approaches that are used throughout both common law and civil law jurisdictions that provide some guarantees of judicial independence. So even though there's no single ideal approach, there are some consistent practices across most common and civil law jurisdictions. And the first I'll sort of point to is in relation to the selection and appointment of judges and their terms of office. So first of all, almost all judges in common law and civil law jurisdictions are appointed to permanent positions, not fixed terms of office. And while there'll be usually a compulsory retirement age, that means that judges cannot be terminated from their positions without their consent, except through some type of formal and fair disciplinary process. The second part of selection and appointment is that this is usually done with some participation of non-judges, and that's not seen as a violation of judicial independence. It's seen really now as an important check on potential problems with judicial self-selection, such as favoritism towards peers, friends, relatives, or the exclusion of certain individuals, based on political or religious sensitivities. And then finally, another common approach is in relation to the financing and administration of justice. And so in most common law and civil law European jurisdictions, the administration of justice is a joint undertaking between the judiciary and some executive agency. That's usually the Ministry of Justice. Also, the administrative staff of the courts is made up of civil servants who work for the Ministry of Justice, and that's the general rule, and judiciaries do not generally appoint their own employees. And then finally, it's a very common practice that the judiciary alone does not set judicial salaries or determine the budget of the judiciary. So that's just some, overall common practice that go across jurisdictions, but just to reinforce that there isn't really any magic formula for guaranteeing judicial independence, and each jurisdiction does need to take on board its own particular historical and structural factors. So I think I'll turn now to really just talking a bit about the UK and the recent experience that we've had in the United Kingdom in terms of some challenges to judicial independence. And I think it's really important to point out that there is not really a history, in a strong history in the UK of media attacks on the judiciary or government officials openly criticizing judicial decisions. So that's a context in which I'll explain what's happened in recent years. There have been a number of judicial decisions that related particularly to the UK withdrawal from the EU that have prompted some really unprecedented government criticisms of the judiciary and subsequently really unprecedented media attacks on the judiciary. The first was a ruling in 2016 on whether the government had to consult Parliament before it could trigger the legal mechanism for exiting the UK. And when that judicial decision went against the government, this prompted a now quite infamous tabloid newspaper headline in which it put the picture of the three judges that decided the case on the front page and labeled them the enemies of the people. What followed from that was also problematic because the government official that is legally responsible under statute for defending the independence of the judiciary, that's Lord Chancellor, failed really to do so swiftly and clearly. And that was also quite unheard of in the jurisdiction. The second attack or challenge came after the 2019 decision by the UK Supreme Court that the government had acted unlawfully in attempting to suspend Parliament for 5 weeks. And this was also in the context of Brexit. And that was an interesting decision in which, again, the government lost the challenge to this. And in an immediate media interview that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, gave, while he said that he fully accepted the UK Supreme Court decision, he then went on to talk and really threaten consequences for the Supreme Court for the decision that was made. That was sort of exacerbated by another cabinet official who publicly stated that the court's decision amounted to a constitutional coup. And then we had a further tabloid warning of a month or two later when the Conservative Party won the general election in December 2019, that, and I'm quoting, no Supreme Court judge is safe in bed following the Conservative general election victory. I do have to say, though, again, in the context of the UK, those are really quite unprecedented challenges to judicial decisions. But these attacks were themselves not without criticism. So while social media has really developed those types of debates in the UK, it has actually enabled others, especially members of the legal profession, to come to the defense of the judiciary and to criticize the government and the media for these attacks. So, it's also important to point out that, the judiciary in the UK is generally robust, and it generally has strong public support. So the attacks were quite unprecedented, but they were themselves not without quite a lot of robust criticism. So in the amount of time that I have left, I really just want to share with you the findings of the UK Judicial Attitude Survey. And what I would like to say in the context of that is that, in democracies, judges have no real voice generally beyond their judgments. They can't enter into social media discussions or comment in the press in relation to their cases or attacks that they might come under. Professional judiciaries really also have no inbuilt public support system. So unlike elected officials, they have no direct link to the public. But in the UK, judges have been given a voice in recent years through the UK Judicial Attitude Survey, and that enables us to understand the impact of some of these challenges to judicial authority. So just to explain, the Judicial Attitude Survey is a longitudinal survey. It examines the attitudes of judges to their jobs and their working lives, and we look at how those attitudes may be changing over time. It's been run 3 times in the last 7 years, 2014, 2016 and 2020. It's going to be run again in 2022. It's completely voluntary. We run it at the UK Judicial Institute on behalf of the judiciaries of England and Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and the UK tribunals. It has an extremely high response rate. The last running, the response rate was 99%, so almost every single judge has taken part in the survey. We always ask a number of key questions, and I'll just share with you some of the findings of that to illustrate what I think is the impact of some of the recent government and media attacks on the judiciary. The first is that we ask judges how concerned they are, or what major changes are they concerned about. And in 2022, so that's after all of the attacks, there were 2 new changes in the judiciary that most concern judges, and that's the loss of respect for the judiciary by the government and attacks on the judiciary by the media. We also ask judges whether they feel valued by different groups in society and in their working lives. And in 2020, while almost all judges said they felt valued by their judicial colleagues and court staff and parties that appear before them, and a majority still feel valued by the public, there are 2 groups that almost all judges said they did not feel valued by, and perhaps unsurprisingly, that's the government and the media. And I really just end by suggesting how these findings can also help to indicate some of the consequences, some of the worrying consequences of these changes on both judicial recruitment and retention. In the Judicial Attitude Survey in 2020, we found that over half of the salaried judiciary say they may be considering leaving early over the next 5 years, and that a new factor emerged as the single most significant reason that would make judges more likely to leave early, and that was their lack of respect for the judiciary by the government. And there's also consequences for the recruitment of new judges. So we always ask judges whether they would encourage suitable people to apply to join the judiciary, and if not, why they wouldn't encourage them. And in 2020, one of the main reasons given by judges was the lack of respect for judges, and that was new. So really, just to wrap up, I'd say a final point on judicial independence is that there's almost always a tension and a debate in any society about judicial independence. It's never static, it evolves over time, and these tensions, will ebb and flow. I think when tensions do flare up, the impact on the judiciary is very hard to measure. And I'd suggest that it's important to provide judges with a safe and independent means of explaining how these challenges to their decision-making and the independence may affect them both in the short term and the long term. And in the UK, I think we've been lucky that the Judicial Attitude Survey provides us with that insight. And I'd really encourage other jurisdictions to consider providing judges with this type of safe voice. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, for your thoughts, and thank you for the work that you and your team do producing that vital and quite sobering data from the Judicial Attitude Survey. I think it's very good as this is a very international audience that we hear often the England and Wales is held up as a jurisdiction where people think that we're sort of the gold standard and there aren't issues, but in fact, as you've just outlined, there are very many things that we should be aware of, and I think that's why this discussion is very timely today. And we're going to now hear from Professor Zoltán Fleck. Zoltán is at Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest. Not quite sure how good my Hungarian pronunciation was there, but it looks like Zoltán said it. I passed with a B. Zoltán has done a lot of work in recent months with some of Hungary's democratic opposition, looking at setting up and developing ideas through a working group that are really tackling some of the constitutional questions around judicial independence. And obviously the Hungarian experience is something that he's going to talk to us about now, as well as addressing some of the extra legal and cultural aspects of protecting judicial independence. So I'm delighted to now hand over to Zoltan.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thanks for inviting me for this excellent panel. And it's really a hot topic all over the world. So judicial independence is not only a thing we can make swiftly and easily by legal regulations. So I will concentrate on some structural and cultural aspects based on the experiences collected in Hungary after 3 decades of the transformation process. No, Hungary is a non-rule of law state, so we have again some serious problems with autonomies in general and independence of judiciary as a lackmus paper of the rule of law quality of a state. So the literature, the special literature on the administration of justice in non-democratic regimes, the experience of post-communist states, and in particular the lessons of the Hungarian and Polish illiberal regimes provide some very serious and general lessons for the wider audience. Given the time, given the limited time available here, I will summarize the negative and the positive thoughts in short theses, if I can. So first, the negative starting points. Firstly, there is no any institutional guarantee that can protect entirely autonomies from an autocratic state. There are hardly any examples of courts being able to escape the will of the authorities in an autocratic context. Judicial independence and other autonomies quickly collapse when external pressure comes from the executive. That is the general historical lesson. The second negative point is that some resisting qualities can be strengthened, but judiciary in nature is reactive. Judges are part of the bureaucratic state structure, especially in the continental tradition. Despite the fact that European legal tradition is based on the values of separation from politics, autonomy of judges is not automatic. It must be done very carefully. The third point, the non-legal guarantees of independence can ensure judicial autonomy in the context of a liberal rule of law. So it is a good point to build a legalistic guarantee system, but automatically it is quite good in the context of a liberal rule of law. The fourth point, there's no universal model, and the institutional models of the judiciary vary widely in the world. Even among post-communist countries, there are a lot of differences administratively in the judicial system. Mechanical adoption of any model could entail a number of risks. The Judicial Council is not a solution in itself. The conditions for its proper functioning must be carefully provided. Hungary has a very wide experience with a full-fledged council model with a lot of problems in the first decade after the transformation process. The last negative point is that results cannot be achieved quickly. Autonomy is cultural in nature and requires learning, a long learning process, even from direct historical experience, it is difficult to learn. So the learning process is hard. So does it follow that the influence of slowly changing cultural factors is deterministic and difficult to change? So not quite. It's not the proper answer for here. There's some context that goes beyond administrative regulation in the narrow sense, but is institutional in nature. But it is still possible to highlight some institutional elements other than self-governance that are relevant in continental legal systems, especially in states with autocratic legal traditions. These are I will enumerate three of these elements. The one is the high relevance of the apex courts. The second is the judicial selection procedure, and the third is the system of nomination of court leaders. These are the traditional channels of political influence in autocratic states, and even post-authoritarian judicial systems are highly different, but these points seem equally demanding in these territories. The second part of my short presentation here is about some positive side, some positive tools, or to put it more clearly, some possible triggers of positive changes. The first is that judicial self-government increases the chances of successfully defending autonomy in the right circumstances. Judicial councils with a wide range of composition and powers operate in modern states, easily leading to corporatist confinement. The Hungarian experience shows that neither external administration nor purely judicial self-government can promote the consolidation of the rule of law, but a balanced cooperation between the judiciary and the executive should be institutionalized. So the proper a well-functioning system is a balancing between the judicial autonomy, judicial council, and the executive authorities. The second point is that the second positive point is that judicial self-government does not simply mean that the body of elected judges has substantial powers. To function well, it requires an active judiciary with self-defensive reflexes, attitudes, and collective strength. So the most important problem now in Hungary, the problem of the collective action, the collective actor problem. Who can speak in the name of the judiciary? Who can cooperate with other professionals? What is the main factors of cooperation among judges defending themselves against the political pressures? So these are not provided solely by the existence of the Judicial Council. So Judicial Council as an administrative model cannot trigger purely this kind of active judiciary or communication among judges. But we need some environmental elements of judicial activity, as these elements can be created or strengthened through appropriate regulation. I do not mean to suggest, though, that it is impossible to influence by conscious institutional means. So we need some institutional means to trigger this kind of self-defending attitudes of judiciary. I named 5 of these contextual institutional elements, which are not properly administrative elements of the judiciary, but a wider contextual institutional elements. The first one is the freedom of expression and self-organization of the judges. This is very important because judges cannot be deprived of the tools that are essential for self-defense. This is often done on the grounds of judicial objectivity. So the Hungarian state regulation, for example, strongly limit the freedom of expression of judges, and this is a serious barrier to self-defense of judiciary. The second point is ensuring the widest possible publicity for relevant judgments, with a continuous effort to keep the public adequately informed, even by judges themselves, for relevant judgments, with continuous effort to keep public. It's very informed. It's very important. But on the other side, a concerted, determined responses must be set to political attacks on judges. So there's an active role of judiciary defending themselves against the political pressures in the media and other sources if it's political, but on the other side, a widest possible publicity for the audience. The third point is a high quality and open system of training for judges. The reform of the methodologies and mentality of the legal education, even in the universities, the legal education is a very important part of this system. The rigid formalism and textualism should be counterbalanced somehow. So the continental tradition, and especially in the post-communist countries and post-authoritarian countries, that there is a strongly formalistic and textualist tradition of legal education, in-house education, and university education also. The fourth point is the well-known conception of legal complex. So the involvement of legal scholars and NGOs, civil societies, and professional organizations in training of judges and any other communications with judicial institutions, active links between legal professions, conscious development of the legal complex is very important because it's a brave ground of a mutual defense system of different professions. So strengthening mutual professional bonds, preventing the possible autocratic strategy of division, because the autocratic state has an inclination to divide legal professionals and legal professions, or atomize judiciary, which is the best possible tactic for an autocratic state. And finally, the strongest possible support for international judicial network and judicial contact system, Europe-wide system of judicial networks and worldwide system of judicial networks. The Hungarian example is quite good for saying that the European judicial contacts, formal, informal contacts among judges are helpful in a context of autocratic state in Hungary and even in Poland. So a dense communication and relations among judges and other professionals are the most effective system of strengthening the autonomy against the executive pressure on judicial independence. So these are the institutional but not administrative tools for strengthening judicial independence, because the core element is an autonomous, brave, conscious judge who can have dense communications and relations to other professionals and fellow judges because normally judges can defend themselves collectively and only collectively. So how to make a collective judicial force, it is the question behind the question of how to defend autonomy of judges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zoltan, for your contribution. And the question that you asked there at the end very neatly brings us to Mehmet Gün from the Better Justice Association. You asked about, in your talk, Zoltan, who can speak on behalf of the judiciary, how can judges cooperate together? And one of the ideas which Mehmet and his team at the Better Justice Association have been looking at in some detail is the important role that independent professional associations can play in protecting judiciaries from attacks. And Mehmet is now going to talk about that and some of the other ideas which came out of the A to Z white paper.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be sharing this panel with all distinguished speakers, and thank you for your contributions. I believe judiciary should be able to speak, but not individually. As an institutional voice, should be able to raised to defend the judiciary. What happened? What has been threatened in the UK? I think, along with what's happening in some of the developing countries, especially in Hungary, shows that actually, judiciary is part of the society. And society needs to be satisfied with the judiciary's stance and services. Ideally, in every democracy, all democratic institutions must function according to their legitimacy. In other words, their reasons of existence, and be accountable. And Professor Gupta's joint article with Tom Ginsburg, suggests that independence and accountability are part of the absolute equation in order to defend the independence of the judiciary. For us, independence is the first and foremost and most important element of the judiciary's democratic functioning. Therefore, judiciary must be able to defend and preserve its independence. But how? Given that it is the public that actually safeguard or compromise the independence of the judiciary. Judiciary, therefore, can defend and safeguard its independence only if the public supports it. If the public does not support the judiciary, then we cannot talk about judicial independence. We have seen many examples, and my country is one of the examples. When people did not support the judiciary, then judiciary loses its independence and become dependent. People will do so, we believe, only if the judiciary is truly accountable for its achievements or failures in servicing the people. They should tell the people that they have achieved certain results or failed for XYZ reasons, so that the people should be able to perceive the conditions within which the judiciary is operating. Therefore, it is our strong belief that judiciary can gain independence and protect it, provided that it serves the people and be the friends of people, not enemies of people, according to its own reason of existence. Therefore, we believe that independence of the judiciary lies in the accountability of the judiciary itself. Therefore, the judiciary must deliver quality services to people and be truly accountable on its services, and also the privileges afforded to them for the service that they are delivering. The accountability, of course, is so important, but it should not be left or entrusted to the ruling politicians or other politicians at all, because in the first place, it conflicts with the judiciary's main duty, which is to hold the executive to account. And it is the judiciary to actually hold the politicians to give account. Therefore, the dynamics of the judiciary and the politicians reciprocating benefits bring about serious compromises in both of their respective accountability. Reciprocal benefiting would result in all forms of coalition between the two, and to the extent that they begin to conspire against the people in return for major, minor, or even minute favors of benefit. When I read a tweet from a large association of judges and prosecutors saying that they have met the Minister of Justice and asked the minister for a favor so that they would be able to use the VIP service at the airport. And the minister told that he would speak to the president about it. This, I mean, even this one results in, compromises of accountability of both parties. Politicians, if politicians are able to hold the judiciary to account, but judiciary is unable to do so, even then politicians will hold the judiciary accountable to them according to their own agenda, which is naturally against the independence of the judiciary. Politicians' agenda, although popular leaders say that they represent the people, but their agenda do not necessarily benefit the people. They have a duty to people, among others, in relation to judiciary also, but they may abuse their authority to seek accountability. Therefore, on balance, I think the judiciary's accountability to politicians should be limited for the purposes of better administration of the judiciary, judicial policies, and appraisal of the judicial service. And it should be limited to these three aspects. Major part of the judiciary's accountability should be addressed through a spectrum of other means. It should be spread through all operations and units of the judiciary at each and every administrative level. In parallel with the accountability, the onus and the ability to defend the independence of the judiciary should be spread to all units of the judiciary, while ensuring accountability at each level of administration of judiciary. The independence of each of the factions forming the judiciary, judicial independence should be treated as the first and absolute condition for quality of judicial services. However, quality service to people must be the first basis for accountability also. Therefore, I think we need to start with defining what is the quality of service, and also devising a system that is able and capable of producing quality services. For us, this aspect requires a new approach to the question, and requires a regulatory authority, an institution that will deal with all aspects of the judiciary service: policies, principles, planning, operations, as well as allowing people to enter the profession, career development, appointment, assignments, promotion, and also expelling from the profession, as well as service production units and the budget. The budgetary importance is budgetary aspects is important, but I think there may be a compromise where judiciary are not that much autonomous in spending public's money. Such institution that regulates this legal services should be central to the judiciary and judicial services. It should be watertight against any potentiality of any influence by any individual, group, or any coalition. Therefore, at the Better Justice Association, we propose to establish a supreme authority of justice. That authority, that institution, can be established by transforming the current Judicial Councils functions for and in relation to the service production functions. and also the functions of the Minister of Justice dealing with or relating to the service production. The second condition for us to securing the independence is to ensure accountability of its regulatory institution, and any judicial service providers should be accountable. One simple way, and I think this is a shame for Turkey that we do not have it, but you, or at least on theory, you have it, is to ensure efficient judicial review of institutions' all decisions. And that judicial review should be triggered by any member of the public at no cost. For this purpose, at Better Justice Association, we propose to establish a court, a new court, Supreme Court of Justice, a high court that deals with judicial issues. The other means that we can add to the equation is to actually to allow all practicing service professionals have their own professional institutions. When I said at the beginning that not individuals but institutions speak for the judiciary, I mean judicial professional institutions. Those should be similar to judicial councils or judicial appointment committees in the UK, a public institution consisted of only practicing professionals and managed by their democratically elected managements. Unlike some country judicial councils and Palermo recommendations, there should be no representative of executive or legislative in their managements. It should be purely established by the practicing professionals. Judicial Council's function, we have already proposed to actually, in relation to the service production, to be transformed in the Supreme Authority of Justice. So judicial councils would be left with the deontological and professional association aspects of the professions. Therefore, we recommend that the judicial council's function should be reduced to being, professional associations for judges and prosecutors, as well as, like the lawyers' bars and notaries' chambers, so that we end up having 3 and 4 very powerful institutions of legal professionals, judicial professionals that are able to speak for the judiciary. We have in Turkey a system where professional associations have this status, a legal status of being a public institutions, like bars are public institutions. So we recommend that the judges' chambers or prosecutors' chambers established like the bars having public institution status. We think that this is important because we need to keep the politics away from the judicial institutions like this, whereas they can form other associations and may get involved with politics. But again, we need to approach it with care and caution. But these institutions, being public institutions, make them open to judicial review in relation to all aspects of their activities. These institutions, therefore, taken outside the political influence and also made truly accountable and subject to the judicial review. They are given 2 kinds of authorities. One kind of authority is actually to defend the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary. And the second is to improve the professionals' standards and also deontological aspect of the profession. For us, accountability of professional service providers need to be designed in a way that positively contributes to development of professionals and to develop and improve their services quality. For this, Professor Zoltan touched upon it, a uniform career plan needs to be developed according to the judiciary service needs. So we need to develop people from education to in profession education, so that they meet the requirements of the judicial service. It should be easy, especially for the European countries where they have career professions. It should be easy for different professions transforming into the others. We have had, after 15 July coup attempt, 40% of the judiciary removed from office because we were unable to recruit seasoned lawyers and experienced ones into the judge and prosecutor position. We had to recruit them from a new, and we have very young people now. More than 50% of the judges and prosecutors are very young, less than 3 years of experience after graduating school. Also, we think that all available positions for the judicial professions should be open to all suitable candidates in an open competition. Thus, it should ensure meritocracy. Judicial privileges should be enjoyed only for and in relation to the performance of judicial duties and must be transparent and accountable. I think code of conduct for the judicial professionals are really important, and it should be open to public. Any violations or abuses should be met with serious consequences. I commend the UK for their very hard approach on that one, trying to, or removing a lot of people from legal profession. I think we need to make similar efforts and increase our scrutiny here also. Appointment of judges to higher courts, like to Constitutional Court, to Court of Appeals, or Court of Cassation, so whatever, or State Council, should be open and transparent, should involve public debate. Ballots for the selection should be open and justified. In a way that I'm proposing Mr. X for XYZ qualities that they have that is suitable for that purpose. So again, those should be open to judicial review. Only if the judiciary secures to provide quality service to the people and ensure high-level, positive, detailed accountability, avoiding political influence, will make it suitable for true and full independence by the public. And only then public is going to support them. Otherwise, as we have seen in a number of countries, people will authorize politicians to actually deal with the judiciary, and politicians will make the judiciary accountable to themselves by making them dependent on themselves. Therefore, I hope that what we have proposed in our proposals would help to improve the ideas to actually, expand on the relationship between independence and accountability of the judiciary relating to the quality service production. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mehmet, for your contribution and for all the work that the Better Justice Association has done in this important area. Finally, we're going to hear from Professor Nuno Garupa. Nuno is a professor of law, as I said, at George Mason University's Anton Scalia Law School. He's got a long established research interest in both the economics of law and legal institutions, as well as looking at comparative judicial politics. And today we're going to hear from Professor Garupa about the role which judicial councils can play in protecting judicial independence, as well as some of the wider trends around judicial trust in Europe, which he's observed.
Thank you, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here. One of the advantages of being the last speaker is that I benefit from everybody else. So I could say, okay, everything has been said. So back to you, Alex. Not really. I do want to go over a few points that already different people made, and I do want to emphasize because I think they're important. The first point I think we can infer from everybody's notes this morning or this afternoon, morning here, afternoon there, or night wherever you are, depends where you're watching us, is that there is no universal solution to the problem of judicial independence, and it is a mistake. In fact, it's a mistake by some of very important international organizations to sort of suggest that there is sort of a toolkit that if any country, any moment in time, whatever their problems, if they follow that toolkit, the problem is going to be solved. I don't think that's correct. Of course, there are best practices, and some of them have been already indicated, but there is no toolkit. And that gets us to the second point, in my view, which is what are we talking about when we say judicial independence? And I think, the different speakers already addressed this. Of course, there's the narrow or the narrowest definition, which would be just personal independence of individual judges. I don't think anyone would challenge that. We do want individual judges to be personally independent, not just from politicians, of course, or the political branches, but from all sorts of other pressures to make their own decision. But of course, that's not really what we're talking about, because I don't think anyone would suggest otherwise. It's sort of the collective independence of the judiciary. And as Cheryl indicated in her talk, when you get to things like a full administrative, procedural, institutional independence, thing gets a little bit more controversial. Because I don't think there is a common agreement, even among scholars, that you really want judges to be self-governed to the point of not having to pay any sort of explanations to anyone, and not to be monitored or accountable or anything they do. So we do have a sort of, as an economist, what I would call some sort of optimal level of independence. It cannot be absolute infinite independence, because that would lead us to the opposite problem, which would be what the French call the gouvernement de juge, right? The government of the judges. We don't want to be governed by judges. And so that gets us into this tension that we all have been talking about some sort of independence, where we have some sort of accountability too, and we want to achieve certain goals. And because these goals differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, I think, as Zoltan was saying, we need some sort of institutional arrangements, and we need to think about what is the best institutional strategy to address this problem. So in authoritarian systems or illiberal democracies, that's fashionable now to use this expression, I think we want to go more independence and maybe err on the side of accountability. And maybe in developed democracies, liberal democracies, sometimes we may want to develop an accountability at the extent that it might sacrifice some independence. So there's a trade-off that we have to address. Now, the real problem, as Alex was mentioning, of what I found in my research on trust and the legitimacy of courts, is that this might also depend on how the public perceives the judiciary. And a lot of these perceptions are also influenced by two main sources that are important. First, what we call awareness, which is the extent to which people are aware of what the judiciary is doing. And that relates to the power of the media, which I think is very important. Some people think the media has a positive role in terms of making people aware of the judiciary. But as Cheryl was explaining in the context of the UK, and I don't think the UK is alone out there, I think it's the same thing in the US and in some continental European countries, the media can actually have the opposite role here. I mean, they can push things in the other extreme and become sort of detrimental to the judiciary if they start pushing, for whatever reasons. We can have all sorts of conspiracy theories here, if people love conspiracy theories, but for whatever reason, if they're pushing in a certain direction, they actually have the opposite effect. And that gets to the second point, is a lot of the awareness of the public is through the media, because fortunately, most people in their lifetime do not have direct contact with the judges of the courts. because most people do not face criminal charges, most people do not sue, most people do not have significant wealth involved in litigation. So a lot of people form their views about the judiciary in the courts through the media. And so the perception of the media is fundamental in shaping the perception of the general public. And that means it can go in different directions. What we do find in our research is that, generally speaking, below a certain threshold of efficiency or effectiveness of court decisions, that is, courts that take forever, courts that are ineffective in the way they answer litigation, may actually produce a sense in public opinion that independence doesn't matter. And that's sort of why this is complex, because it depends very much on the perception people have about courts. So in some countries, you have people who basically do not value independence because they think the courts are just inefficient, ineffective, they don't matter, they don't really help your economic and social life. And so we need, and of course, at the same time, we cannot expect to improve the efficiency of courts if the courts are not independent. And so it creates a sort of a chicken and egg problem, which might benefit, for example, in some authoritarian governments. It might make just life easier to an authoritarian government. I mean, we have several examples in Latin America where people didn't really care about judicial reform because they thought that courts were bad anyway. And why do I care if an authoritarian government is threatening the courts? I mean, they're bad anyway, they're corrupt, they're inefficient. Why should I care? And so this makes it the whole thing much more complex, which gets into the judicial councils. Now, judicial councils, again, have to be understood in their institutional setting, as actually Zoltan was saying. We have multiple different experiences around the world. I mean, judicial councils can be a source of empowerment and source of judicial independence, a source of institutional response to executive and legislative entrenchment, but they can also have the exact opposite role. I mean, they can be an easy source of capture. What we have seen in some countries is that when the government doesn't trust the Supreme Court for whatever reasons, maybe because the Supreme Court comes from a previous regime, or because the Supreme Court is made of people from a social group different from the group in charge of the government, they create a council not to make the judges independent, but actually to make the judges controlled and limited by the council. So councils can go both ways. They can be a source of full empowerment. They can be a source of full capture by the government. It's going to depend very much on the powers, the composition, and the structure, the institutional structure of these councils. So we should be careful when we approach this subject. Again, insisting on the point I made, sometimes councils are presented as part of a toolkit by some of the international organizations. You need to have a council. If you want to have judicial independence, you need to have a council. And then that's fine. You have a council, you get some extra points in the ranking, you're doing very well in terms of judicial independence. Let's be careful about that. Unfortunately, we do have to go to the details, and we do have to go to see how these institutions operate. And the same with judicial associations. I mean, we can obviously see why judicial associations are important. If you're going to try to be independent, of course, you're much better if you have some sort of coordination of individual behavior of the judges. And so judicial associations are important in that respect, because they help coordination agendas, they help coordinating the role of judiciary. They may even coordinate, in many cases, the elections to the Judicial Council, because if you're going to have judges sitting on the Judicial Council, they have to be elected some way. And so judicial associations might be the mechanism to do that. But they can also be easily captured by political parties. And as I keep emphasizing, in Europe, we see that reality. I mean, in my native country, Portugal, we have one judicial association, which is fairly detached from political parties for historical reasons, but they're extremely important in pursuing the agenda in terms of salary, perks, promotion of the judiciary. But if I go to my neighboring country, Spain, I see the exact opposite. They have politicized, in fact, they become parties and associations. You have a left wing and the right wing and a centrist judicial association. They reflect the agendas of the parties. And of course, when they decide in the composition of the Supreme Court, They're looking about how many politicians will be charged with corruption. How many judges of our association need to sit in the panel that is going to rule on this particular politician? If we're going to litigate administrative decisions by the government, that the government is unhappy, am I from the opposition or am I from the party in government? How many people do we want to put on the different panels to decide these cases? So it has the exact opposite problem. And this has to do not really just the judges, it has to do with the political culture, the party culture, and going back to my point, the role of public opinion. Because if you have a public opinion that consents to these things, that feels okay with these things, they in fact vote for the parties that do these things, it's going to be very hard to maneuver around. If you have a public opinion that's quite, tough on this and gets upset when parties do these things, then you may have a mechanism, which is the public opinion pressure. And that gets me to my last point, because we're really running out of time, which is this idea that many people developed of counter-majoritarian judiciaries. The idea that the role of the government is to be counter-majoritarian. But again, I think that has to be contextualized, because you can see how a counter-majoritarian judiciary is an effective sort of control to a powerful executive. But you can see also the opposite problem, which is very soon people will be accusing a counter-majoritarian judiciary of hijacking democracy, of limiting democracy, because they're not allowing the democratic elected political branches to do whatever political program they have for this particular legislature or this particular term in office. And so we have, again, to be very careful when we endorse these principles of counter-majoritarian judiciaries, because it does depend very much, in my view, on the institutional settings and political settings. And in that regard, I just refer to Zoltan's words that this is about institutions. This is about creating the incentives outside of the nitty details of procedure and laws and statutes. It's really about the big picture. And I think the big picture just varies from country to country. So thank you once more, Alex. I hope I was short to allow time for questions.
Thank you very much, Nuno. That was extremely helpful. And in fact, the first question, which has come from someone in the audience, touches on something you and Zoltan and indeed Cheryl have all raised, which is this question about context-specific approaches. And I think Mehmet's very aware of this too, thinking about the proposals that he and his team have drafted and how far and wide they might be applicable. So the question is whether or not judicial independence does manifest itself differently in established versus emerging democracies. And if it does, which seems to sort of be the consensus of the group, does this not cast a bit of a shadow or a question around judicial independence as an international principle, if we're saying that it has to be applied quite differently in different contexts? Zoltan, I saw you nodding your head. Do you want to give that a go first, and then we'll go to Cheryl?
Yeah, thank you. It's really a general wide question, and I do think that there is a universal core sense of judicial independence. I don't want to go back to history, even the history of philosophy and the history of legal science, but from Immanuel Kant, we know what autonomy is. So we need some basic elements of autonomy, personal autonomy and collective autonomy, to define judicial independence. But the question is right that among modern nations there are a lot of differences of the question of how to build a judicial autonomy, and we have different legal historical traditions, and in Hungary, for example, independence means a very strong wall against the executive. but it's not universal. There are some other countries where independence means a lot of other things also, because we have a strong tradition of bad experience with a too strong executive and too strong pressures from the political parties and political state. But it's also an element of a universal judicial independence tradition or concept, because modernity, the European legal tradition is, according to Harold Berman, for example, is based on the autonomies, and this kind of autonomy is really the core concept, and it's enough to find some common elements of judicial independence, but it's like an onion. So there are some lines and some levels of different experiences and traditions, but there is a core, and this core is quite simple. It's the autonomy.
Cheryl, you've looked at many judicial onions. What's your take, having worked in a range of jurisdictions at sort of different stages of their development in terms of moving towards full democracies?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and one that's often overlooked a bit. But I would say that, you know, of course, it has to be different. The particular structures and practices that an individual jurisdiction will put into place or discuss to achieve judicial independence will have to be different according to the history and culture of that. The political system, as I said before, the political system, the legal system, and the judicial system. So, you know, just to take, for example, you know, if you're comparing a jurisdiction that has had an independent judiciary for hundreds of years, its concerns about judicial independence are necessarily going to be different than a jurisdiction where there hasn't been an independent judiciary as a result of you know, a non-democratic regime being in place and co-opting the judiciary for, you know, for potentially, you know, decades or centuries. So, you know, that's why I was very much trying to emphasize at the beginning that there isn't a one-size-fits-all. There are some basic practices, however, that are actually consistent across common law and civil law jurisdictions. I tried to highlight a few of those in terms of selection, in terms of office, and sort of administration of justice and financing of judiciary. But there isn't a model, and I completely agree with some of the discussion already today that it's very dangerous when perhaps NGOs go around the world and suggest there's a nice little package that emerging democracies can adopt in order to achieve judicial independence. There does need to be the sensitivity to the history and culture of each jurisdiction.
And Mehmet, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, having spent a lot of time looking at the Turkish history and tradition. Did you find, as the Better Justice Association, you obviously drew on research and academic perspectives on these questions around judicial independence, but how important is the context to your work? I know you've looked at some of the old historic traditions in terms of judicial careers and career planning that very much come from you know, hundreds of years of Turkish sort of judicial scholarship.
Well, first of all, historically, our judges would serve for 2 years in good times of Ottomans and Selçukians, in 2 years only, and then would be recalled for 1 year education. And the sultans would appear before the judges is equal to their subjects. So this is still in our minds, and we try to achieve that. It's really difficult to do so. We have studied and searched, not in academical depth, but in practical, for practical reasons, we have studied various different systems of successful, unsuccessful countries. Of course, I agree that history and culture is important in devising your system, but rather than coming up with one model that is suitable for all, but agreeing on basic principles. And basic principles is an institution in our minds is capable of serving people with quality service. That has to be number one. And the second one, the system is designed to enable it to provide that service in good quality. And service providers, we have to realize and accept that there are at least three different parties: judges, prosecutors, and lawyers, plus the notaries. They all together come together and provide the service. So we need to ensure that they are independent, but in a constructive manner, contributing to the service production. Yes, of course, judicial councils have done quite a lot, and in the way to actually ensuring independence of judges. But as we have seen in Turkey and other countries, they are also making it very easy target, as Professor Garupta said, that to capture the judicial council is one way of capturing the judiciary. So the independence should not be, at one point of the institution, the network of institution, but it should be spread throughout all the systems, so that every individual institution or regulatory authority should be able to defend it. If one fails, the other should be able to pick it up and defend it. So, of course, everybody has their own systems, but we're talking about democracies. Democracy is a separation of powers, the three main powers. How to most effectively structure this power according to these principles, I think does not really make much difference. So in a way, I think, and as NGOs, we represent people, not the establishment, and NGOs should take care of the responsibility and come up with proposals, so that the difference of opinion would lead to most independent, autonomous structure, as I believe. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to just briefly also touch on this sort of idea of judicial voice, and we heard a number of speakers talk about the pressure which the media can exert on judges. Nuno, I wonder if you've got any thoughts on the extent to which, in an age of social media and with much more press, Cheryl sort of touched on it in the Judicial Attitudes survey. Obviously, judges are now more conscious of criticism coming their way. Do you think judges should be more proactive, either through their associations or perhaps senior sort of members of the bench who have roles within jurisdictions, about coming out and directly engaging with the media to either explain, the good work the judiciary is doing, or to push back on false narratives that might take root for various political reasons, or if particularly controversial issues are being discussed?
Well, that's a difficult question. Again, I mean, I don't want to be disappointing in saying it depends, but actually it does depend. I mean, we have had experiences where judiciaries have tried to be more proactive, both in traditional media or even social media, and things backfired. Because once you engage in the sorts of communication through the media, that's not really what judges are good at. Because they're supposed to be judges, not media people, and once you try that way, you sort of get entangled in political discourses. I do have to say, on the other hand, I find it very difficult for a judiciary in our society, in our century, just to think they can behave as some sort of high priests in their high towers, where they make these decisions with words that nobody understands and with reasonings that nobody understands, and then expect society just to say, yes, we agree with that, and we'll take them as sort of the last word of the Lord. That's not going to happen. So I think judiciaries have to struggle with this. They have to find ways to basically engage in communication, but at the same time, not to become politicized or embroiled in some sort of party discussions that might happen. I mean, going back to the UK example, if the courts are going to be involved in Brexit, I welcome that personally, because I think we need that sort of involvement. But once you are involved, of course, you're part of the discussion. I mean, you can't just not think that whatever you're going to decide one way or the other, that one side or the other is going to love and hate you. And so this is inevitable. I wonder, for example, some of the problems in particular the civil law countries is the extent to which a more use of dissent opinions is important to sort of show that you can have different views. Because part of the problem is also to recognize that a legal question can have different answers. I mean, this idea that sort of goes back to Carl Schmitt that if it's a legal question, it has one right answer. That's just not, that's a myth. It has to be put aside. And so the fact that we show a divided judiciary might actually, in my view, benefit the judiciary. Again, depending on the context.
Zoltan, and then I'd like to come to Cheryl just to sort of wrap things up. Just one sentence about the freedom of expression of judges. From the perspective of rule of law, I must say that judges have a very important role in strengthening rule of law values in society. So the judiciary has a socializing function in democracies, and it's very important in the post-authoritarian countries that the rule of law values must somehow broadcasted by those guys who are actively involved in doing justice. And I see the dangers of too wide public opinion or a too wide active role of judges in media. But on the other side, there's a proper function of judiciary to socializing audience for rule of law questions, and the question of justice, for example, is not only a philosophical issue. It's a social issue. How to build a supporting social background for rule of law values. I think as judges have some say on this.
Thank you, Zoltan. And Cheryl, and what have you sort of gauged from the conversations you've had with senior judges about how they feel about this tension, about how forward they should be about coming out and protecting the institution, but also doing some of the things that Zoltan said about just getting the public to understand their role within our complex systems?
Yeah, I think that the 2 points made by Nuno and Zoltan were, really kind of right to the point, which is, I would say certainly the senior judiciary in the UK, I don't think that they're too overly concerned that they need to have a larger public voice. But I think that the point about the socializing effect of the judiciary and judicial decisions, and Nuno's point about the judiciary making sure that its decisions are understandable to the public is it really incredibly important points. And I think it illustrates an important point about the judiciary having a role in the public education on the legal system and the judicial system for their societies. And that can come, it doesn't have to come from appearing in the media and making public statements. It comes in part through judicial decisions, but judicial decisions that are accessible and understandable to the public. And that's a challenge, I think, for any judiciary, because judges are steeped in the law and it becomes very difficult for them sometimes to actually appreciate that legal concepts are not understood widely by everyone, and that judicial decisions do need to be accessible. But there's a range of ways that judiciaries can do this. They can provide nice press summaries that explain their decisions in clear language. They can make the judicial process more understandable and more accessible by using media and welcoming public education programs into courts and so on. So I think there are very more modern ways for judges to have a voice. And my personal view is I don't think that requires judges to become media commentaries and to be taking an active political role. That really is a fundamental challenge in many countries to judicial independence and the rule of law.
Thank you, Cheryl. And for the last word, I'll hand it over to you, Mehmet.
Thank you very much. I want to say about this, then, about the issues that the judges adjudicate, their decisions actually speaks for themselves. About the administrative difficulties that the judges are suffering or enjoying, nobody is talking on behalf of them. They're getting accused. In my country, for example, the ordinary people are really cross that the judges do not get traffic tickets. And in one of my conferences in a remote corner of Anatolia, the lawyers came up to me and some businessmen, they said, well, they need to be able to communicate with the judiciary because those judges had shut their doors and would not speak into the public. So I think at least for the administrative side of the, their duties, they need to be able to speak, but they need to speak objectively and, issuing reports, how, their resources are limited or extensive and what results they have achieved. I think they need to give account of what they did and what they did not or have failed. They need to give account to the public. Otherwise, without communication, in the end, public is going to really take the independence away. Yes, I think the UK can keep it for a long time and has kept it for a long time. I think there's going to be some time, we see it in other countries, examples that, public is going to take away the independence of the judiciary as we are in Turkey. We think that, independence of the judiciary is a must, that the judiciary must have independence. The next statement is that, but we cannot give that much independence to the judiciary. So we are living in this, paradox here because people did not receive good service from the judiciary. And they have become a privileged group like the people in France. Why did not French people find a solution to their CSM so far? Because they have not addressed those issues between the judges and the society. So we have the same problem, and our solutions could come only if people speak objectively. Yes, of course, criticism about the judiciary should be made objective and not the way in the tabloid in the UK. But again, our motto is that judiciary must serve to the public and earn the public trust. Then they can be given full independence. And the way to ensure it is accountability. I hope, and I'm very grateful that we have discussed and agreed on these basic principles. Thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you very much, Mehmet. And once again, on behalf of all the audience and everyone who will be watching this on catch up on YouTube and on LinkedIn, we'd like to say a huge thank you to all of our panelists, to Cheryl Thomas, to Zoltan Fleck, to Nunan Garupo, and to Mehmet Gün and the Better Justice Association. There will be other webinars that will deal with similar themes around the rule of law and the challenges that many countries are facing in protecting the judiciaries and ensuring that justice is able to be done and seen to be done. If you'd like to find out more about the Better Justice Association, just have a look on Google by putting their name in, and you can read the full proposals from A to Z of judicial reform. But once again, thank you everyone for joining today, and we very much look forward to welcoming you again for another webinar in the future.
Thank you.